most people misunderstand why empaths stay. They see someone repeatedly forgiving, repeatedly understanding, repeatedly trying to repair a damaged relationship, and they assume weakness. They assume dependency. They assume fear of being alone. But in many cases, what they are actually witnessing is something far more complex. They are witnessing a person whose emotional depth allows them to see possibilities that others cannot see. An empath doesn't just see who you are today. They see who you could become tomorrow. This is both their greatest gift and, at times, their greatest vulnerability. While most people evaluate relationships based on current behavior, empaths often evaluate them based on potential. They notice the pain behind the anger. They notice the insecurity behind the arrogance. They notice the wounded child hiding behind the defensive adult. Their minds naturally search for explanations rather than judgments. This is why they often stay in situations that seem confusing from the outside. When someone else sees disrespect, the empath may see unresolved trauma. When someone else sees distance, the empath may see fear. When someone else sees hostility, the empath may see someone struggling internally. Now, this doesn't mean empaths are naive. In fact, many are highly perceptive. They notice far more than they reveal. They often recognize problems long before anyone else does. But because they understand human complexity so deeply, they are often willing to give people opportunities to grow. The problem is that understanding someone and tolerating harmful behavior are not the same thing, and yet many empaths blur that line without realizing it. Psychologically speaking, empathy creates a powerful emotional connection. Research consistently shows that when we understand another person's suffering, our brains become more motivated to help them. We become invested in their well-being. We want to reduce their pain. For an empath, this process can become amplified. They don't simply hear someone's story, they feel it. They don't simply observe someone's struggle, they internalize it. As a result, they often become emotionally committed to helping people overcome challenges, even when those people are not equally committed to changing. This creates a fascinating dynamic. The empath begins carrying responsibilities that were never theirs to carry. They become the emotional stabilizer, the peacemaker, the listener, the encourager, the person who keeps showing up. And because they are capable of carrying so much emotional weight, people often assume they can carry even more. Over time, this becomes a silent burden, not because the empath complains about it. Quite the opposite. Most empaths become experts at hiding their exhaustion. They smile while struggling. They support others while neglecting themselves. They give energy they no longer have because caring for others has become part of their identity. From the outside, everything appears fine. Internally, however, something very different is happening. Every disappointment leaves a mark. Every broken promise creates another layer of emotional fatigue. Every act of disrespect chips away at trust. The empath may continue showing up, but the emotional cost is quietly accumulating. This is important to understand, because many people assume relationships end suddenly. They don't, at least not for empaths. What appears sudden is often the final chapter of a story that has been unfolding for months or even years. The decision to leave usually begins long before the actual departure. It begins with moments of disappointment that go unaddressed. It begins with needs that remain unmet. It begins with conversations that never lead to change. And still, the empath stays. Why? Because loyalty means something different to them. In a world where many relationships are treated as disposable, empaths often view commitment as sacred. They believe people deserve patience. They believe growth takes time. They believe mistakes should not automatically define a person's character. These beliefs are admirable, but they can also become dangerous when they are not balanced by boundaries. Philosophically, there is an important distinction between compassion and self-sacrifice. Compassion says, I care about your pain. Self-sacrifice says your pain matters more than mine. One creates connection, the other creates imbalance. Many empaths spend years learning this lesson. They discover that love cannot heal someone who refuses responsibility. They discover that understanding cannot replace accountability. They discover that patience cannot create change in someone who has no desire to change. Perhaps most importantly, they discover that saving everyone is impossible. This realization is often painful because it challenges a core belief they have carried for much of their lives. The belief that if they just love harder, understand deeper, forgive more, or stay longer, things will eventually improve. Sometimes they do, but often they don't. And that's where the emotional conflict begins. Because the empath is forced to confront a difficult truth. Staying is not always an act of love. Sometimes staying is an act of fear. Fear that leaving means giving up. Fear that leaving means becoming like everyone else. Fear that walking away means abandoning someone who still needs help. Yet maturity teaches a different lesson. You can care about someone deeply and still recognize that they are responsible for their own choices. You can love someone and still refuse to tolerate behavior that destroys your peace. You can wish someone well and still walk away. The strongest empaths eventually learn that protecting their energy is not selfish. It is necessary. Because when a person continually pours from an empty cup, eventually there is nothing left to give. And that is the hidden reality behind why empaths stay so long. It is not because they don't see the problem. It is because they see so much more than the problem. They see potential, they see possibility, they see humanity. But eventually, even the most compassionate person must ask a difficult question. How much of my life am I willing to spend waiting for someone else to become the person they promised to be? And that question is where everything begins to change. Because an empath's loyalty is powerful, but once it is forced to compete with their self-respect, the countdown to goodbye has already begun. What makes this situation even more fascinating is that most people never recognize the moment they are losing an empath. Not because the signs aren't there. The signs are usually everywhere. The problem is that they rarely look the way people expect them to look. Many assume that if someone is unhappy, they'll become louder, they'll argue more, they'll make dramatic demands. They'll issue ultimatums and create conflict until they get what they need. Empaths often do the opposite. Before they leave physically, they begin leaving emotionally. And because this process is gradual, it often goes unnoticed by the very people who should be paying attention. This is one of the great psychological paradoxes of empathy. The people who care the most are often the least likely to make their suffering visible. Think about it. An empath spends so much of their life paying attention to the emotional needs of others that they become skilled at minimizing their own. They learn how to absorb discomfort. They learn how to stay calm during chaos. They learn how to keep functioning even when they are hurting. To the outside world, they appear strong. What nobody realizes is that strength can become camouflage. The empath may be struggling deeply, but because they continue showing up, because they continue smiling, because they continue fulfilling their responsibilities, others assume everything is fine. Meanwhile, something important is happening beneath the surface. They are watching. They are evaluating. They are collecting information. Every broken promise is remembered. Every dismissal is noted. Every act of disrespect is quietly filed away, not out of resentment, out of awareness. People often imagine that empaths are guided entirely by emotion. In reality, many empaths are highly observant. They are constantly gathering data about behavior patterns. They notice inconsistencies between words and actions. They notice when apologies are repeated but change never follows. And eventually, a realization begins to form. The problem isn't that the other person doesn't understand. The problem is that they understand and continue doing it anyway. That realization changes everything. Before reaching that point, however, the empath usually sends numerous signals. The first signal is often communication. Contrary to popular belief, most empaths do not leave without trying to explain what hurts them. They express concerns. They initiate conversations. They attempt to create understanding. They offer opportunities for repair. The challenge is that their communication is often subtle compared to more confrontational personalities. Instead of demanding, they request. Instead of attacking, they explain. Instead of threatening consequences, they hope mutual understanding will be enough. Unfortunately, people frequently mistake gentleness for a lack of seriousness. Because the empath remains calm, others assume the issue isn't important. Because the empath remains patient, others assume there is unlimited time. Because the empath remains compassionate, others assume forgiveness is guaranteed. This is one of the most expensive mistakes a person can make. When someone repeatedly tells you what hurts them, they are giving you a roadmap. Ignore that roadmap long enough, and eventually you lose access to the destination. The second warning sign is emotional withdrawal. This stage is often misunderstood. Many people think emotional withdrawal means the empath has stopped caring. In reality, emotional withdrawal usually begins because they have cared for too long without seeing progress. They become tired, not physically, emotionally. The conversations become shorter. The enthusiasm becomes weaker. The emotional investment becomes smaller. The person who once wanted to discuss every problem now seems strangely quiet. This silence is often interpreted incorrectly. Others assume the issue has resolved itself. But silence does not always indicate peace. Sometimes silence indicates exhaustion. The empath has reached a point where explaining the same pain repeatedly feels pointless. Psychologically speaking, this happens when effort and reward become disconnected. Human beings are motivated when they believe their actions can influence outcomes. When repeated effort produces no meaningful change, motivation declines. The empath begins asking a difficult question. Why keep fighting for something that only one person seems committed to saving? That question creates distance, and distance creates clarity. The third warning sign is a reduction in emotional availability. This is perhaps the most overlooked signal of all. The empath who once rushed to support everyone suddenly becomes less accessible, not because they are cruel, not because they are seeking revenge, because they are preserving energy. For years, they may have been operating as an emotional resource for everyone around them. They listened, encouraged, reassured, and carried burdens that were never truly theirs. Now they begin redirecting that energy inward. They start focusing on themselves. They invest in personal growth. They spend more time alone. They reconnect with interests they neglected. From a psychological standpoint, this is a healthy correction. But to those who benefited from the empath's constant presence, it can feel unfamiliar. Sometimes it even feels threatening. Why? Because people often don't realize how much value someone provides until that value begins disappearing. The fourth warning sign is acceptance, and this one surprises people. Most assume acceptance is positive. In many situations it is. But when an empath reaches a certain level of disappointment, acceptance can signal something very different. They stop arguing. They stop persuading. They stop trying to change the other person. Not because they suddenly approve of the behavior, because they have accepted reality. They no longer expect transformation. They no longer expect accountability. They no longer expect the relationship to become what they hoped it would be. This is one of the most dangerous moments in the entire process, because from the outside, things appear calmer than ever. Arguments decrease, conflict decreases, tension decreases, everything looks stable. Yet internally, the empath may already be detaching. The emotional bond that once fueled endless patience is beginning to dissolve. And once that process starts, reversing it becomes increasingly difficult. Philosophically, this reflects a profound truth about human relationships. People don't leave when they stop loving. They often leave when they stop believing. Love can survive disappointment. Love can survive mistakes. Love can survive conflict. What struggles to survive is the loss of hope. The moment someone believes their effort no longer matters, the foundation begins to crack. That is why the warning signs matter so much. They are not punishments. They are opportunities. Opportunities to listen. Opportunities to grow. Opportunities to take responsibility before the damage becomes permanent. Because by the time an empath becomes completely silent, completely detached, and completely at peace with walking away, the decision has usually been forming for far longer than anyone realized. And that leads us directly to the moment most people never see coming. The line that changes everything. The point where patience ends, clarity arrives, and the empath finally decides there is no reason left to stay. Pay attention to the quiet warnings today, because tomorrow's goodbye is often built from the signals you ignored yesterday. And this brings us to the moment that most people misunderstand completely. They think an empath leaves because of one argument, one mistake, one bad day, one disagreement. But that's almost never what happens. When an empath finally reaches the point of no return, it is rarely the result of a single event. What appears to be a sudden decision is usually the culmination of hundreds of experiences layered on top of one another. Small disappointments, repeated dismissals, broken promises, unacknowledged pain, tiny fractures that over time become impossible to ignore. The reason this moment is so significant is because it represents a shift that occurs deep within the empath's perception of reality. Up until this point, they have been operating from hope. Hope that communication will help. Hope that patience will matter. Hope that understanding will create change. Hope that the person they care about will eventually recognize the damage being done and choose a different path. Hope is powerful. In many ways, it is the fuel that allows empaths to stay longer than most people ever could. But hope has a limit. And when that limit is reached, something extraordinary happens. The empath stops asking, "How can I fix this?" and starts asking, "Why am I still carrying this?" That question changes everything. Because the moment responsibility shifts back to where it belongs, clarity begins to emerge. Psychologically, one of the deepest needs every human being possesses is trust. Trust is not simply believing someone will tell the truth. Trust is the feeling of emotional safety. It is the belief that your vulnerability will be respected. It is the confidence that your words matter, your emotions matter, and your presence matters. Without trust, relationships become unstable. Without trust, connection begins to deteriorate. Without trust, even love struggles to survive. This is why betrayal affects empaths so profoundly. And betrayal is not always dramatic. People often imagine betrayal as infidelity, deception, or some obvious violation. But betrayal can take many forms. Repeatedly dismissing someone's feelings can be betrayal. Consistently choosing selfishness over mutual respect can be betrayal. Making promises with no intention of keeping them can be betrayal. Manipulating someone's kindness can be betrayal. Treating loyalty as something to exploit rather than appreciate can be betrayal. For an empath, these experiences cut deeply because they violate the very foundation upon which the relationship was built. Remember, empaths invest heavily in emotional connection. When they care about someone, they often do so wholeheartedly. They listen deeply. They support generously. They forgive repeatedly. They show up consistently. Because they operate this way, they naturally assume the relationship is built on mutual sincerity. When they discover that sincerity is not being returned, the emotional impact is significant. Not because they are fragile, because they are genuine. And genuine people experience dishonesty differently. The pain is not merely about what happened. The pain is about what the event reveals. It reveals a mismatch between words and actions. It reveals a gap between appearance and reality. It reveals that the relationship they believed existed may not be the relationship that actually exists. This realization creates what psychologists sometimes describe as cognitive dissonance. Two conflicting realities collide. The empath wants to believe the best, but the evidence keeps pointing elsewhere. For a long time, they attempt to reconcile these contradictions. They rationalize. They explain. They justify. They search for context. They search for reasons. They search for hidden explanations that make the behavior easier to understand. But eventually, reality becomes impossible to negotiate with. And this is the line most people never see. It is not a line drawn by anger. It is not a line drawn by revenge. It is not a line drawn by pride. It is a line drawn by truth. The empath reaches a moment where the facts become louder than the excuses, where patterns become impossible to deny, where clarity finally outweighs hope. And once that happens, a profound psychological shift occurs. The person who spent years giving the benefit of the doubt suddenly stops needing more evidence. Not because they stopped caring, because they finally understand. Understanding, ironically, is often what ends the struggle. People assume understanding creates endless tolerance. Sometimes it creates the opposite. Sometimes understanding reveals that nothing is going to change. And once that realization settles in, the empath begins seeing the situation differently. The emotional fog lifts, the confusion disappears, the internal debate quiets down. For perhaps the first time, they stop focusing on who the other person could become and start focusing on who they have consistently chosen to be. That distinction matters. Potential is seductive. Potential keeps people waiting. Potential keeps people hoping. Potential keeps people investing. But relationships do not exist in potential. They exist in reality. An empath can spend years loving someone's potential while suffering under their reality. Eventually, wisdom demands a choice, and wisdom usually chooses reality. Philosophically, this moment represents something much larger than a relationship. It represents self-respect awakening. Self-respect is not arrogance. It is not superiority. It is not the belief that you are better than anyone else. Self-respect is the recognition that your dignity has value, that your emotional well-being matters, that your peace deserves protection. For years, the empath may have prioritized understanding others. Now they begin understanding themselves. They begin recognizing that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. that forgiveness without accountability becomes permission, that loyalty without reciprocity becomes exploitation. And once these truths become visible, they cannot be unseen. This is why the line feels so final. It is not simply an emotional reaction. It is an awakening. The empath is no longer trapped between conflicting interpretations. They see clearly. And clarity is difficult to reverse. People often believe they can regain access to someone by offering explanations after the damage is done. Sometimes they can. But when an empath reaches this stage, the issue is rarely a lack of explanation. The issue is that they have already heard the explanations many times. What changed was not the information. What changed was their willingness to ignore reality. That willingness is gone. And when it disappears, something remarkable happens. The fear of leaving becomes smaller than the cost of staying. That is the moment the line has truly been crossed. Not when the empath becomes angry, not when they become emotional, but when they finally realize that preserving their peace is more important than preserving an illusion. Because once an empath sees the truth clearly, they stop fighting to save the relationship and start fighting to save themselves. And when self-respect finally becomes stronger than hope, the ending is no longer a possibility. It is only a matter of time. Once that line has been crossed, something begins to happen that often confuses everyone involved. The empath changes. Not dramatically at first, not in a way that immediately captures attention. In fact, the change is so subtle that many people completely miss it. For years, the empath may have been the person holding everything together, the one initiating conversations, the one checking in, the one trying to understand, the one carrying emotional weight that was never entirely theirs to carry. And then, almost imperceptibly, they stop. This is the moment people often mistake for indifference. It isn't indifference, it's acceptance. There is a profound psychological difference between giving up and letting go. Giving up is driven by frustration. Letting go is driven by clarity. Giving up still contains emotional resistance. There is still a battle taking place inside the mind. There is still an argument between what is and what could be. Letting go is different. Letting go occurs when that argument finally ends. The empath is no longer trying to force reality to match their hopes. They are no longer trying to negotiate with patterns that have repeatedly shown themselves. They are no longer trying to convince someone to become who they never truly chose to be. Instead, they accept what is. And acceptance creates peace, not immediate peace, not perfect peace, but the beginning of peace. This is why the departure of an empath is often so misunderstood. Most people expect a dramatic exit, they expect shouting, they expect revenge, they expect emotional chaos. Yet empaths frequently leave in the opposite way. Quietly, calmly, almost unexpectedly, because the emotional storm happened long before the physical departure. The tears were shed months earlier. The disappointment was processed long before the goodbye. The internal struggle was fought in private. By the time the empath finally walks away, they are often far ahead emotionally from the person they are leaving behind. This creates one of the most fascinating dynamics in human relationships. The person who seemed least likely to leave is suddenly gone, and the person who assumed they would always stay is left trying to understand what happened. Psychologically, this can feel shocking because human beings adapt quickly to consistency. When someone repeatedly forgives, we begin expecting forgiveness. When someone repeatedly stays, we begin expecting them to stay. When someone repeatedly prioritizes our needs, we begin assuming they always will. Over time, gratitude can quietly transform into expectation. And expectation is dangerous, because once we begin expecting something, we often stop appreciating it. The empath's loyalty becomes normal. Their patience becomes normal. Their understanding becomes normal. Their presence becomes normal. Until one day it disappears. And only then does its value become fully visible. This is where many people make a critical mistake. When they notice the empath pulling away, they assume the solution is urgency. They panic. They make promises. They offer explanations. They suddenly become attentive. The problem is that they are responding to the departure rather than addressing the pattern that caused it. The empath is not leaving because of a single moment. They are leaving because of a history that has already been evaluated repeatedly, a history that has already been discussed repeatedly, a history that has already been forgiven repeatedly. This is why the empath's decision often appears so final. The departure itself may look sudden. The decision was not. The decision was built slowly, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, disappointment by disappointment, boundary by boundary, until eventually the evidence became overwhelming. And once that evidence reaches a certain threshold, something remarkable occurs. The empath detaches emotionally. Now, emotional detachment is often misunderstood. People hear that phrase and imagine coldness. They imagine cruelty. They imagine a complete absence of feeling. But true emotional detachment is neither cold nor cruel. It is the removal of unhealthy attachment. It is the recognition that another person's choices are ultimately their responsibility. For years, the empath may have carried an invisible burden. They may have felt responsible for fixing problems they did not create, responsible for healing wounds they did not cause, responsible for maintaining connections that required effort from both sides. Detachment releases that burden. For the first time in a long time, the empath stops carrying what was never theirs. And the result is often surprising. Their energy returns, their confidence returns, their clarity returns. The emotional resources once spent managing dysfunction become available for growth. This is why people are often shocked by what happens after an empath leaves. They expect collapse. Instead, they witness transformation. The person who seemed exhausted becomes vibrant. The person who seemed uncertain becomes decisive. The person who spent years supporting everyone else begins investing in themselves. From the outside, it can look sudden, but the transformation was developing beneath the surface long before anyone noticed. The departure simply created the space for it to emerge. Philosophically, this reveals an important truth about human nature. Freedom is not merely the absence of restrictions. Freedom is the absence of unnecessary burdens. Many people remain trapped not because they lack options, but because they continue carrying responsibilities that do not belong to them. The empath eventually realizes this. They realize that caring about someone does not require sacrificing themselves. They realize that love cannot survive where respect is absent. They realize that loyalty loses its meaning when it is only flowing in one direction. And perhaps most importantly, they realize that peace is worth protecting. This is where the so-called door slam phenomenon often originates, not from hatred, not from resentment, not from revenge, but from certainty. The empath has reached a conclusion. The relationship has taught its lesson. The pattern has revealed itself. The reality has become undeniable. And because the decision is rooted in clarity rather than impulse, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to reverse. People often underestimate how significant this moment is. They think the empath simply walked away. In reality, the empath walked toward something, toward self-respect, toward emotional freedom, toward a future no longer defined by constant disappointment. That distinction matters. Because healthy endings are not merely escapes. They are acts of alignment. They occur when a person finally chooses a life that reflects their values rather than their fears. And that is exactly what happens when an empath finally leaves. The person who once spent years trying to save everyone else finally remembers that they too deserve saving. And when someone reaches that realization, their departure is rarely an act of rejection. It is an act of self-respect that has finally become stronger than their willingness to suffer. After the empath is gone, the story does not end. In many ways, it is only beginning. This is the part that people rarely talk about because most conversations focus on the departure itself. They focus on the breakup, the separation, the final conversation, the moment the door closes. But the most important transformation often occurs afterward, in the silence that follows. Because when an empath finally walks away, they are not just leaving a person behind. They are leaving behind a version of themselves, the version that tolerated too much, the version that carried responsibilities that were never theirs, the version that confused endless sacrifice with love. And that process can be both painful and liberating at the same time. At first, there is often grief. Not necessarily grief for the relationship as it actually was, but grief for what it could have been. This is an important distinction. Human beings rarely mourn reality alone. We mourn possibilities. We mourn futures we imagined. We mourn hopes that never materialized. For an empath, this can be particularly intense because they invested so deeply in potential. Remember, they stayed because they believed. They believed conversations could lead to understanding. They believed effort could lead to change. They believed loyalty would eventually be reciprocated. When they leave, they are not simply releasing a person. They are releasing a vision. and every meaningful release requires a period of adjustment. But something remarkable begins happening during that adjustment. The emotional energy that was once directed outward starts moving inward. For years, perhaps decades, the empath may have been focused primarily on other people, understanding them, helping them, supporting them, protecting them. Now that energy has somewhere else to go, back to its source. Psychologically, this creates a powerful opportunity for growth. Many empaths discover parts of themselves they had neglected for a very long time. Interests they abandoned, dreams they postponed, goals they placed on hold, passions they ignored, because someone else's needs always seem more urgent. Once the constant emotional drain disappears, those forgotten parts of themselves begin coming back to life. And this is where transformation starts. Not through revenge, not through proving anyone wrong, but through rediscovering who they are when they are no longer carrying everyone else's burdens. One of the most profound lessons an empath learns during this period is the difference between being needed and being valued. These concepts are often confused. Being needed can feel meaningful. People depend on you. People seek your help. People turn to you during difficult moments. But being valued is different. Being valued means your presence is appreciated rather than expected. Your efforts are recognized rather than assumed. Your humanity is respected rather than exploited. Many empaths spend years surrounded by people who need them. Only later do they realize how few people truly valued them. This realization can be painful, but it is also liberating. Because once you understand the difference, you stop measuring relationships by how much people take from you and start measuring them by how much mutual respect exists between you. That shift changes everything. Another transformation begins to occur as well. The empath develops stronger boundaries. Now, boundaries are often misunderstood in modern culture. People sometimes view boundaries as walls, as forms of rejection, as evidence of becoming cold or detached. But healthy boundaries are not walls. They are filters. They do not keep everyone out. They allow the right people in. The empath who once said yes to everything learns the power of saying no. The empath who once ignored red flags learns to trust their observations. The empath who once sacrificed their peace to maintain connection learns that peace is not something to bargain away. This is not cynicism. It is wisdom. Wisdom is compassion informed by experience. And experience teaches lessons that no book, seminar, or conversation can fully provide. The empath begins understanding that kindness without boundaries attracts exploitation, that generosity without limits invites imbalance, that forgiveness without accountability encourages repetition. These are not comfortable truths, but they are necessary truths. And once learned, they become part of the empath's foundation moving forward. Interestingly, this transformation often creates an unexpected reaction in those who were left behind. Many people do not fully recognize the value of an empath until the empath is gone. This is not because they are malicious. It is because familiarity creates blindness. When someone consistently provides support, patience, understanding, and emotional safety, those qualities can begin to feel ordinary. Their absence reveals their significance. Suddenly, the listening ear is gone. The constant encouragement is gone. The person willing to see the best in them, despite their flaws, is gone. And for many, this realization arrives too late. Not because reconciliation is impossible, but because the empath has already completed an internal journey. They are no longer standing where they once stood emotionally. They have moved forward. They have learned, they have grown. And growth changes what a person is willing to accept. Philosophically, this reflects one of life's most important principles. Every relationship teaches us something. Even painful relationships, perhaps especially painful relationships. Some teach us how to love, others teach us how to trust, and some teach us how to protect ourselves. The empath eventually understands that the suffering was not meaningless. The disappointment was not meaningless. The heartbreak was not meaningless. Each experience revealed something important, not merely about others, but about themselves, about their worth, about their limits, about their needs, about the kind of life they want to create moving forward. This is why the ending, while painful, often becomes one of the most important turning points in the empath's life. Because what begins as loss gradually transforms into clarity. And clarity becomes confidence. Confidence becomes action. Action becomes transformation. The person who once feared walking away eventually realizes that walking away was the very thing that allowed them to become who they were meant to be. That is the ultimate irony. The departure that once seemed like an ending becomes a beginning. The goodbye becomes a doorway. The loss becomes a lesson. And the lesson becomes strength. So if there is one thing to remember from everything we've discussed, it is this. An empath does not leave because they stopped caring. They leave because they finally learned that caring for others should never require abandoning themselves. And the moment self-respect becomes stronger than self-sacrifice, their entire life begins to change.